By then, Steve will be ready, okay? Yeah, sorry about that.
No problem, no problem.
But again, I'll just ask you to.
Yeah, sure. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And while you're grabbing food and drink, I'll just introduce myself very briefly. My name's Steve Allen. In spite of my accent, I am in fact American. I joined the Rebels about 2 years ago, so it's great to be here with you this afternoon. I'm currently Professor of Music at Rider University. My PhD at Oxford was in the opposite Benjamin Britten. In 2012 we launched a new BA at Rider University in pop and rock music culture. So I also teach on the Beatles and Radiohead, and I'm currently researching Bruce Springsteen. So I have sort of this double life in terms of my academic life. I'm also very involved in the brass band scene. I came up actually through the brass band tradition in the UK. I actually started to play the euphonium because of asthma. The doctors had no cure for asthma back in the 1960s, so they said, blow something. And all that was left was the euphonium. So I got the euphonium going, and that's actually what led me into the world of music. And long story short, I got me onto the academic side of things, because there's, as you may know, the word euphonium is Greek for unemployable. So, so you had to find another branch of music to pursue. And so it will come as no great surprise to you this afternoon that I want to talk for a few minutes about Elgar THE SEVERN SUITE. I'm producing a number of articles for a major journal who actually asked me to do this. This journal is interested in bringing the brass band repertoire into the mainstream of musical discourse, and it's tended to be looked down upon and sort of seen as outside of both serious art music and also of popular music. It's never really quite nestled comfortably in between those two things. For example, this Monday I'm going to be conducting a concert in Lancaster with a transcription of Verdi's Force of Destiny, but also a transcription of On the Town by Leonard Bernstein, and some Irish traditional music and a Spanish flugelhorn solo. So the repertoire is very varied in this kind of way, and it's led to it not really being located, I suppose, is the word that you could use there. But this enlightened journalist and this editor has said to me they want me to produce, and the first article that came out was on the whole Moorside Suite, which was in 1928. And there was a particular gentleman called Herbert Whiteley who worked for a fantastic impresario called John Henry Iles, a very flamboyant character, who employed Whiteley basically as his administrator. Whiteley was the editor of the British Bandsman, which was the only major news organ for brass band people at the end of the 19th century. And he also ran the company, R. Smith and Company, which was the only brass band publisher, or major, I should say, brass band publisher at the time. And he also ran the National Brass Band Championship. So Herbert Whiteley, as an administrator, had his finger in all of these pies, and he'd set out really from the beginning of the 20th century, because the National Championship actually started in 1900. He made it his goal to try to attract the big names. He wanted to attract the big composers. A lot of lesser composers had done transcriptions of orchestral pieces and operatic overtures in the 19th century. But Whiteley was enlightened in terms of thinking, you know, we have this British Renaissance, and we need to seize some of these people and get them to write for this uniquely British musical institution. So Whiteley was actually able to persuade Holst in 1928 to write a Moorside Suite. Elgar had actually promised verbally to Whiteley in 1912 that he would do something, but he didn't. And until 1930, when he was about to write The Last Judgment, which was the third part of the cycle of the Kingdom of the Apostles, the big oratorio cycles, right? And he was paid, if I remember rightly, he was paid £500 to write the final instalment, which would have been The Last Judgment. But unfortunately, the gentleman died, and his estate demanded that Elgar repay the money. So Whiteley put up the commission fee from £100 to £150 for the brass band work, and that was enough to twist Elgar's arm, as it were, okay, and press him into action. And he produced the piece that I've produced a kind of an outline, I suppose, of the score here that will give you something of the structure of the presentation I want to make. And the work is really interesting from several perspectives. Number one, Elgar's wife Alice, who was his main factotum in life, died in 1920, and she seemed to be an incredible support system in every way, from his religious faith, Catholicism, which subsequently died actually after she died. His faith pretty much became extinct right around the time that he wrote the Seventh Suite, right the way across to being his muse, basically making sure that he wrote the music that he was meant to be writing. And once she died, it was such a catastrophic loss that final decade and a little bit, he died in 1934, was really a bit of a desert. He actually pretty much gave up writing music as a focus and became a kind of an amateur scientist, which may have some bearing on this piece actually, interestingly enough. And from time to time he would be moved, for example, when he moved back to this house in Napleton from London, he wrote a piano fugue, which was simply called Fugue in C minor, very, very short 4-minute piece that was really just a personal piece for himself to play. It was never really performed publicly in that format as a piano piece. And then in 1925, his good friend Sir Ivor Atkins, who was the organist at Worcester Cathedral, persuaded Elgar to allow him to do an organ transcription of that fugue. And it's very possible that as Elgar heard that transcription performed on the organ, it might have sowed, in my mind, a seed of a thought that down the road he may in fact add other movements to that to turn it into some kind of organ sonata or organ suite, possibly. Something of that idea may have been ticking in the back of his mind, not least because Ivor Atkins and himself, they were such close friends. It would be natural that he would be thinking in those kinds of terms, and that would indeed become his second organ sonata in B flat actually. That would actually be a transcription of the Seventh Suite, without the minuet and with the addition of a brand new cadenza that pretty much Ivor Atkins had written. So there's the fugue, and this was ticking on in the back of his mind. And then around 1921, Elgar also did a transcription of a fantasia and a fugue in C minor, same key, by J.S. Bach. He and Richard Strauss actually had this kind of bet that one of them would do the fantasia and one of them would do the fugue. I believe, if I remember right, I think it's Elgar that was meant to do the fugue and Strauss was meant to do the fantasia, but Strauss reneged on the bargain. So Elgar ended up doing the whole thing. And that came out in 1921. And it's very, very interesting in that the opening of the fantasia really finds a kind of an echo in the theme, in the subject of the fugue, which is really interesting. And there's no evidence to show this, but my theory, my current working theory, is that Elgar, when he was approached by Whiteley in 1930 and started to think about producing this brass band work, that it may very well have been that the fugue was the first thing that was in his mind. I am actually now going to bring brothers and sisters, as it were, to collect around this central fugue, and the fugue will be the central music of the piece. The other very interesting thing about this last period, and this is where the scientific analogy comes in a little bit, is that Elgar started to dig consistently through his old sketchbooks. And any music that he did produce in this final decade really was spurred by these sketches. Some of you may even be aware of Anthony Payne's elaboration on some of those sketches for the Third Symphony. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but Elgar had left these sketches for a Third Symphony, just sketches, and ordered his wife to destroy them on his death, and of course she didn't. In fact, the sketches were the first thing to be published, I believe. Bit naughty. After Elgar died, and
Was his second wife?
No.
this is Alice.
She predeceased him, though, right?
So she preceded.
Yeah, so she couldn't burn anything after his death.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Sorry, yeah. His daughter, I should
Oh,
say.
daughter.
Caris.
Okay.
well helped. Yeah, his daughter Caris, and it was the first thing that was published. And then in the 1980s, 90s, Anthony Payne completed these. He actually created an entire symphony, actually, a third symphony out of these sketches, which is really interesting because Elgar himself was really doing the same thing in many ways. He was tinkering through sketches. In fact, as you can see from the notes here on the sheet, he started to reach back to all kinds of musical memories, actually, as he put the suite together. And in this sense, the suite becomes interesting because it functions as a kind of a palimpsest, a document that is written on and then covered over and then written on again and then covered on over and written on again. So that in a sense it almost has layers, and these layers together form a kind of lateness style, this idea of a late style, where Elgar's mature music is combined with music from his younger life in almost kind of a retrospective purview of everything that he had done before. So, for example, just to run down the handout that I've given you here, the introduction, and let me, some of these words will cue off distractions for me to bring in certain pieces of information. And one of the things I want to say right at the beginning here is that I think it's important to understand that the entire music of the suite was written before Elgar gave it the title. Okay, so the picturesque title of the Seventh Suite, and Elgar very famously said as a very young boy, he used to play in the reeds and rushes of the Severn River, which ran through his hometown of Worcester, and he said that his earliest attempts at writing music were trying to capture what he believed the river and the reeds were actually telling him to write down. So the Severn itself has this kind of mythological, rich sort of mythological role, if you will, with his own work. And also he had a very close friend called Leicester, who ultimately became mayor of Worcester, who wrote 2 books on Worcester. One in 1928 on medieval Worcester that looked back nostalgically at the Worcester of the long ago past, compared favourably with the sort of current modern secular Worcester. And then in 1930, just after the Seventh Suite was performed actually, a second book on Worcester came out in which Elgar wrote a written introduction. And he and Leicester had actually been, as boys, had actually played together in a reed quintet. We'll come back to that in just a few moments. So the thing I want to sort of point out then is that this music in a sense was conceived in an abstract way. In fact, the dedicatee, George Bernard Shaw, who was one of Elgar's great friends, and as Elgar felt his musical language to become a little bit like Sibelius actually, to become more and more out of date. In fact, you know, Sibelius's relative silence during his later years kind of, in a sense, mirrors Elgar's. I think Elgar was a bit busier than Sibelius in the final years. Nonetheless, there was definitely this sort of very much of a sort of a backpedaling that went on. And so this suite was conceived as a dedication to George Bernard Shaw. And sadly, a letter to George Bernard Shaw that has not been found resulted in a reply where George Bernard Shaw said, "I don't think I'm worthy of a symphony." Now, it could be that Elgar had suggested dedicating a possible third symphony to George Bernard Shaw, and that's what he was responding to. It could also equally indicate that possibly Elgar had suggested the brass band piece be something symphonic. Unfortunately, we don't know. That's a little riddle we can't quite get down to the bottom of, simply because that letter from Elgar is missing. Okay, but again, we get a very strong indication that this music was conceived in an abstract way, and that the poetic title was added later. And you'll see by the side of each of the movements I've also included movement subtitles that were apparently created by Gale, Henry Gale, G-E-E-H-L, Henry Gale, who was a brass band transcriber and arranger, whose job it was actually to do a military band arrangement of the Seventh Suite, and he actually added those movement subtitles in to each of the movements, which are, interesting enough, medieval, so they do seem to relate back to this kind of age of chivalry of medieval Worcester. But again, it's important to point out that all of these were afterthoughts. Elgar later adopted those subtitles in his full orchestration for orchestra of the Seventh Suite, but they were not present in the original brass band version. It's almost as though the piece becomes increasingly programmatic as it evolves through its life. And the only reason why I think that's really important is because if we get trapped too severely into a programmatic reading of the piece, I think we might overlook some of the points I'm trying to make in my paper today, which are these symphonic and rather abstract ideas of friendships, relationships, lateness, and a dialogue that Elgar is having with himself in terms of his own musical past. So the introduction, in fact, is almost like an exposition of a symphony. There are 2 themes, and this music is totally original to 1930. And interestingly enough, both of these themes are kind of related to the fugue that had been written in 1923 and that's now been transcribed to become the middle movement of the suite. The first one, bum, 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 ba-dum, a long note, 2 quite short notes and 2 relatively short notes, becomes an ostinato that is repeated over and over again with different enharmonic readings, almost as though Elgar is kind of turning it over. And to some extent, there's even a slight sort of pictures at an exhibition promenade sort of feeling about this, especially in the way that he uses some of this music later on in the suite, almost as though Elgar is walking in between each of these movements, looking at each of these movements. And that, interesting enough, that particular theme is related to a much earlier march from his cantata Caractacus, written in 1898, which has a similar march that goes bum, 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 and that becomes an ostinato that repeats over and over again. And similarly to the Seventh Suite, it also has a very Elgarian bump, da, boom, da, 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 dum, 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 and in the Seventh Suite it's bum, boom, da, da, dum, da, dum. So that the introduction is, if you will, a ceremonial march. It's interesting, isn't it, that Elgar didn't put a march in this suite, given the famous Pomp and Circumstances. And of course, Pomp and Circumstance number 5 was actually written while he was working on the Seventh Suite, and was similarly based on his childhood sketchbooks. It was performed, I think, just about a week or two before the Seventh Suite was first performed. So we have Elgar, as it were, reaching back to the Caractacus march in this first theme. And then the second theme, da da dee da da dee da 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 dee da da, which is a series of 2 rhythms, da dum da dum da dum da dum da dum, which seem to turn over half steps and whole steps, tones and semitones, which are kind of essential, along with major and minor thirds, are an essential part of the dialogue that unites the whole piece together. This similarly is related to the fugue subject in terms of its rather static rhythm, its rhythmic profile. Okay. Then we have the toccata. Now, Whiteley had sent in a letter to Elgar, and I think probably included the score of the whole Moorside Suite with a number of other scores. And he actually said to Elgar, the Moorside Suite was a disappointment to the brass bands because it wasn't challenging enough. In brass band competitions, there's a great, almost macho privilege given to technically difficult playing. So Whiteley had sort of planted this idea in Elgar's mind: whatever you do, write something that's really challenging so that we can separate the wheat from the chaff in these brass bands that are operating at a sort of a national level. So the toccata is indeed, as the title might suggest, very fast music, okay? And interestingly enough, the musical ideas are based on primarily a short 4-bar sketch that Elgar had made in 1928 for some incidental music for a play about Beau Brummel, an extravagant London dandy. And he took these 4 bars and basically made these 2-bar phrases, 2 of the themes that make up the main material of the toccata. The third theme is original. I call it a cadential canon. And effectively what he does then is he plays cards. Elgar was a great card player, and he basically shuffles the deck of these statements and redistributes them throughout the tournament. Right at the centre, including twice, this grandioso theme, which is almost a typical bum 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 bum, which inevitably produces this memory of Elgar cycling through the Malvern Hills. Any of you that have seen Ken Russell's film from the 1960s in black and white, one of the very first British musical biographies or documentaries of any English composer, have multiple pictures of Elgar riding his bicycle through the Malvern Hills, being inspired. And it's impossible not to hear that very romantic, and that's pure romantic Elgar. That is actually middle period Elgar being recalled in that statement. In fact, I was talking to Anthony Payne yesterday on the phone about this. In his finale of the Third Symphony, he uses a theme from King Arthur as the second subject from bar 68, which is similarly Elgarian in this kind of full-blown romantic sense. There's almost like a sense of rubato and heartiness about this music that is very, very different from the somewhat more neoclassical sounding music around it and in the suite. And this neoclassical idea we'll come back to in just a moment. The fugue, as I mentioned earlier, is really in many ways the centerpiece. If you want to think of it as a flower, okay, the fugue is really the bud. And outwardly the toccata and the minuet, and then even further out, the introduction and the coda have musical material that are related to each other in a kind of an arch form. And of course the fugue itself is this transcription, as I said before, from the the Napleton fugue. The only detail I want to point out here that's really interesting is that the fugue is very, very much redolent of the Enigma theme, with its fourths and minor thirds. There's very much of a flavour of that about the fugue theme, and that's relieved by this beautiful descending series of thirds. This dying fall in thirds, which is actually a theme, even a leitmotif actually, taken from the Caractacus cantata. It's called the mistletoe theme. And very, very briefly, Caractacus was a British king who fought the Romans in the Malverns, so there's very much of a local flavour about this, and he was defeated by the Romans. In fact, that Caractacus march, bam, 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 describes, ironically, the Roman victory over the English. It's ironic that Caractacus march became almost Elgar's very first uniquely British music, the music that sort of marked him out as an English poet laureate, even though it was describing the defeat of the British at the hands of the Romans. You can't get a lot more ironic than that, can you really, you know? And there was this subplot, a druid called Orbin and his girlfriend Igon, who was Caractacus's daughter, an invented character. And of course, Orbin is the bard, he's the druidic bard. So the subcontext of this may very well be that Orbin and Igon represent Elgar and Alice in some way, although it's also impossible to escape quite the conclusion that Caractacus, there's a good bit of Elgar in Caractacus, the character of Caractacus. However, if you follow the thinking here, this appearance of mistletoe in the middle of the fugue, written 2 years after the passing of Alice, does seem to support the idea of the fugue as some kind of commemoration of their marriage, some kind of commemoration of that really deep intimacy. And in fact, in the February of 1930, while Elgar was working on the Seventh Suite, an English composer called Granville Bantock and his daughter Mona went up to visit Elgar, and Elgar took Bantock off into a side room, and according to Bantock's daughter, poured out his heart about how still, a decade later, how utterly devastated he was without Alice. So you know, the pain of this loss was still as pointed at the time Elgar was working on this suite, and it may again help us to understand why we find the fugue now in its third manifestation, the first for piano, the second for organ, and now in its version for brass band. Then in the minuet, he reaches back even further, and there's a certain sweet charmingness about this minuet, because he reaches back to wind band music that he had written back in the later part of the 19th century. He taught himself to play the bassoon, and he played in a wind quintet that they called the Brothers Wind. And this was the quintet in which Lester, the fellow I told you about earlier who wrote the book on, he played, I believe it was oboe in that quintet. And because they rehearsed in the shed behind Elgar's father's home, they called the music sheds, which is kind of quaint. And every Sunday while the sermon was being preached in Elgar's church, he would sit there writing out a brand new shed for them to rehearse that afternoon. And the challenge was every week he had to produce a new piece, okay? And out of these sheds came a very, very impressive series, actually, of works called Harmony Music. And Harmony Music number 5, the most impressive, is definitely symphonic in its scope. And the opening theme of the minuet from Harmony Music number 5 becomes the minuet theme of the Seventh Suite. And then there was another much shorter series of wind band pieces that he wrote called Promenades, and a lot of these were written in London and were about London. And the fifth of those promenades, the main tune of that promenade, is then borrowed by Elgar and transplanted alongside the other trio tune to become the two main episodes of the minuet. And they're linked together by a little triplet hinge. The first theme from Harmony Music 5 goes da dee da 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 dee da da da. It's very Mozartian and very gallant. And Elgar had actually, back in the period when he was writing this, he had actually played Mozart's Symphony in G minor in an orchestra. gone home, taken score paper, ruled out all of the bars that were the equivalent of the number of bars in all of the movements of that symphony that Mozart had written, and then attempted to write his own symphony. In that, it's actually called his Mozart Symphony. And the minuet theme may well have been the one that he used in the Seventh Suite. So again, look, we get yet another. Now we have Mozart, we had Bach, now we have Mozart. So we have, again, he's sort of reaching out to all of these different figures that were such inspirations to him. And it's really quite ingenious how he puts these two things together, because the promenade number 5, which is dotted, almost double dotted in its effect, is linked by the hinge of that triplet, da-da-ga-da, that triplet also occurring at the end of the original Shed 5 minuet theme. So that's kind of neat, almost like a little joke that Elgar plays. I'm going to use that hinge that is in both those pieces and snap them both together in this entirely new context. And of course, in doing this, he's evoking both his Worcestershire youth in the first theme and his London life by using the theme from Promenade number 2. So again, we find geography, specific geographies, if you will, alongside specific friends and specific composers, all playing their role in this music. And then finally, out of this minuet, which has this cadential figure that goes ba-ba-bum, the very last time, the segue into the coda are 3 drum rolls on the bass drum. Almost though it's interesting to get the alarm from the emergency vehicle out there, because in a way, it's hard to hear these drum rolls as anything other than a sign of death. It's just very difficult in the context, especially because this music in the minuet is his earliest music. Almost as though Elgar has gone back as far as he can go, and now he's left contemplating his own mortality. And out of those 3 drum rolls, which match, interestingly enough, they match the rhythm of the cadence from the minuet, ba-ba-bum, three drum rolls, right? We then evolve into the coda, which is in fact a recapitulation, again seeming to hint at some kind of symphonic design. However, in this recapitulation, we have resonances and echoes of all of the other movements that we've heard, before finally a kind of a scream in the soprano cornet and an anguished dissonance on F with a B natural resolving into the A of that triad right before the final statement, that seems to suggest this pained anguish of death is the end. There is nothing beyond this. His Catholic faith has gone, Alice has gone, all of my childhood memories, all of the great achievements that I made as the great man of music have now gone, and it's over. And so the work comes together with this very noble, proper cadence, but we're left with this overwhelming feeling of lateness and nostalgia in the piece. The last thing I really want to consider is the idea of neoclassicism. Obviously, Elgar was aware of all of the trends that had happened in continental Europe, the Rite of Spring, the First World War. Of course, the Rite of Spring and the First World War almost single-handedly swept away the entire world that Elgar really belonged to, not just in his music, but also personally. And that, along with the death of his wife, would also have contributed to that relative silence in those last 14 years. But interestingly enough, Elgar was also responsible through his relationship with the Three Choirs Festival, which was one of the big choral festivals in Britain at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. He actually commissioned Arthur Bliss, a young composer who was still studying with Vaughan Williams at the time, to write a symphony. And Arthur Bliss wrote this wonderful symphony called a colour symphony. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. In my opinion, one of the most underrated of British works from that English Renaissance period. It's a super piece. And in that work, Bliss basically displays all of his French neoclassical credentials. And apparently Elgar was a little bit uncomfortable after hearing it. He didn't feel that for him it had quite worked. But he could not possibly have ignored the fact that neoclassicism had arrived with a real bang in English music. It's also interesting, although this has no bearing on the Seventh Suite, that Vaughan Williams in 1933 produced another great British piece that's sadly neglected, his piano concerto, which Bela Bartok was a huge fan of, which is basically Vaughan Williams becoming about as neoclassical as Vaughan Williams was really prepared to be. So I've entertained the idea that with this commission coming in from Whiteley, with this symphonic idea of an organ sonata for Ivor Atkins, with all of this patchwork of musical references, that Elgar may have titillated himself with the thought, what if you can teach an old dog new tricks? What if I could write, not a French neoclassical symphony, but what if I could take the spirit of neoclassicism, go back to the Baroque period and early classical period, where the suite was as essential a musical form as the symphony. Symphony really became a privileged art form after Beethoven. What if I go back to the suite, and what if I combine these movements of the suite together, but also in a way that refers back to the idea of the sinfonia? So we'll put a sonata form frame around this piece. And even though I will not write my third symphony, my official great romantic masterpiece that everybody's expecting that will sound so old-fashioned post The Rite of Spring, what if instead I produce a symphony in drag, a symphony in disguise, also similarly disguised as a brass band piece? I think this goes some way towards explaining why, number one, he gave it an opus number, and there are very, very few pieces in this last 14-year period that receive it. Also, that he approved immediately the concert band transcription. Also, not only had he learned the actual mechanics of brass band scoring, which is a very weird science. Most of these composers would simply write a score in C and then hand it off to someone like Henry Gale to produce a brass band score. Elgar, one of the great orchestrators of the 19th century, decided to learn brass band scoring for himself. And there are actually two published brass band versions, the original here, and in 1996 Bramgay produced this version, which worked on the theory that the original one was a tone too low. And this one also incorporates a lot of rethinks that Elgar had when it came to orchestrating the piece for full orchestra. And isn't it interesting that he not only took the trouble to orchestrate the whole piece for orchestra, but it was one of the few pieces that he recorded with the London Symphony Orchestra on the EMI label. The Seventh Suite, a work originally for brass band. So I put it out there to you today that we have in this Seventh Suite a great example not only of Elgar's response to neoclassicism, but also in a way a kind of third symphony of which the classical world was really otherwise denied. Thank you very much.